Welcome, survivors, to the edge of the apocalypse, where every story is a fight to stay alive. Thanks from the bottom of my heart for every like, comment, and sub. Keep hitting that bell and join the fight with me. Thanks from the bottom of my heart.
The static wasn't supposed to scream. It was a jagged, wet sound that tore through my headset, a rhythmic gnashing that felt like teeth on cold steel. I slammed my palm against the console, trying to clear the frequency. But the sound only grew louder, more intimate. United 702. Say again. You're breaking up. I barked into the mic, my voice steady despite the prickle of ice down my spine. I was 300 feet above the tarmac in the O'Hare Tower, the god of my own little glass kingdom. But for the first time in 12 years, the kingdom was falling silent. On my primary radar, 702's blip flickered, then stuttered. The pilot didn't respond with flight levels or coordinates. Instead, I heard a wet, slurping sound, followed by a scream so high-pitched it didn't sound human. It sounded like a whistle kettle left on a burner in hell. My hands started to shake, a fine tremor that rattled the plastic casing of my headset. Outside the wraparound windows, the Chicago skyline was a distant, uncaring glitter. But below us, the taxiways were a mess of halted metal. My supervisor, Marcus, was 3 consoles down, his face a mask of gray static. He wasn't looking at his screen. He was looking at the monitor for the terminal security feed. "Elias," he whispered, and the way he said my name made the sweat on my forehead turn to frost. I stepped over, my boots heavy on the industrial carpet. On the grainy black and white screen, Terminal 1 was a slaughterhouse. It wasn't a riot. Riots have a rhythm, a push and pull. This was a feeding frenzy. I saw a TSA agent pinned against a check-in kiosk, 3 figures draped over him like vultures. They weren't punching or kicking. They were leaning in, their heads bobbing with the frantic motion of dogs tearing at a carcass. The agent's legs kicked once, twice, and then he went still, his blood a dark, spreading ink blot on the linoleum. "What is that?" Marcus asked, but I couldn't answer. My throat was a desert. Suddenly, the radio crackled back to life. It was 702. The co-pilot's voice was a frantic, hyperventilating mess. "Tower, we have a breach. Cockpit door is down. Captain he's not. Oh God, there's so much blood. They're coming through the jump seat, requesting immediate emergency landing on 10L. I looked out at 10LA. Southwest flight was stalled right in the middle of the runway, its engine still whining. -702, 10L is obstructed. Turn left, heading 270, climb and maintain. I stopped. The blip for 702 wasn't turning. It was fast. I grabbed the binoculars, my fingers fumbling with the focus. I saw it then. The massive Boeing 747 was banking hard, too hard, its wings clipping the tops of the perimeter light poles in a shower of sparks. It wasn't a landing. It was a fall. The plane hit the grass 300 yards short of the runway, the nose gear collapsing instantly. The fuselage buckled, the metal screaming as it plowed through the earth, sending a wall of dirt and debris into the air. It didn't explode. It just broke open like a ripe fruit. And then the doors didn't open. The emergency slides didn't deploy. The jagged holes in the side of the plane began to spill out people, but they weren't running away from the wreck. They were stumbling, their movements jerky and unnatural. spreading out across the tarmac toward the ground crews who were rushing out to help. I watched through the lenses as a mechanic in a neon vest reached a survivor. The survivor didn't take his hand. He lunged, his teeth sinking into the mechanic's neck with such force that I heard the wet snap even through the thick glass of the tower. "Lock the doors," I whispered. Marcus didn't move. He was staring at the elevator bank behind us. The light above the doors was ticking up. Level 4. Level 5. We were at the top. Level 8. "Marcus, lock the damn door," I screamed, lunging for the security keypad. But the elevator dinged. The doors slid open with a cheerful automated chime that felt like a death knell. Our night shift intern, Sarah, stood there. Her lanyard was twisted, her blue blouse soaked in a deep oxygenated crimson. She wasn't breathing. Her jaw hung at an impossible angle, unhinged, and her eyes were two milky orbs of white marble. She stepped out, her movements a twitchy, stop-motion nightmare. Marcus backed away, his hands up as if to ward off a bad dream. "Sarah? Kid, you okay?" He was an idiot. He was looking for the girl who brought him coffee, not the thing that had replaced her. Sarah didn't growl. She made a clicking sound in the back of her throat, like a predator mimicking a bird. Then she moved. She was fast, faster than anything the dead should be. She hit Marcus with the weight of a freight train, her teeth finding the soft meat of his shoulder before they even hit the ground. The sound of Marcus's scream was muffled by the roar of another plane, an unauthorized takeoff screeching down the parallel runway, its pilot clearly choosing the sky over the madness on the ground. I didn't help him. I couldn't. The adrenaline was a metallic tang in my mouth, a sharp electric current that told me to move or die. I grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall, the cold metal biting into my palms. I didn't look at Marcus as his screams turned into gurgles. I didn't look at the radar screens where a dozen more planes were descending into a graveyard. I ran for the emergency stairs, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The stairwell was a concrete throat, echoing with the sounds of chaos from below. Every floor I passed, I heard it. The scratching on the heavy fire doors, the low, guttural moans of things that no longer knew how to speak. I reached the 3rd floor when the power cut. The emergency lights kicked on, casting the world in a nauseating rhythmic pulse of red. In the flicker, I saw them. 3 of them, blocked by the heavy door but visible through the small reinforced window. They were pressing their faces against the glass, their skin peeling away in wet strips, their fingers raw and bloody from clawing at the steel. I kept going, my legs burning, the smell of jet fuel and copper filling my lungs. I reached the ground floor lobby, and the smell hit me like a physical blow. The stench of an open grave. The lobby was a wreckage of shattered glass and luggage. A luggage cart was overturned, its contents strewn across the floor like a trail of breadcrumbs. I crouched behind a marble pillar, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it would crack them. 10 feet away, a security guard was slumped over the desk, or what was left of him. A woman in a torn business suit was hunched over his midsection, her hands buried deep in his torso. The sound of her eating was a wet, rhythmic tearing, like someone pulling apart a roast chicken. I gripped the fire extinguisher, my knuckles white. I needed to get to my car. The parking lot was 100 yards across the open tarmac. If I could just reach the Corolla, I could get out, find my wife, get to the cabin. The thought of her face, her smile, was the only thing keeping the terror from swallowing me whole. I moved, staying low, creeping toward the shattered remains of the front entrance. The cold night air hit me, smelling of smoke and winter. The airport was a sea of orange fire and black shadows. Dozens of planes sat like dead whales on the runways, their lights flickering out one by one. I stepped over a body, then another, my boots slick with something I didn't want to identify. I was halfway to the lot when a shadow detached itself from the side of a fuel truck. It was a man in a pilot's uniform, his cap still perfectly straight, his eyes gone. He didn't scream. He just started to run. He was silent, a ghost in a blue suit. His footsteps, a light patter on the asphalt. I didn't wait. I bolted. My lungs burned as I sprinted, the fire extinguisher a heavy, useless weight in my hand. I reached the car, fumbling for my keys, my fingers slick with sweat. The pilot was closing the gap, his arms outstretched, his fingers twitching. I hit the unlock button, the chirp of the car sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. I dived inside, slamming the door and locking it just as his face slammed against the driver's side window. The glass didn't break, but the sight of his teeth scraping against the pane, leaving streaks of yellowed saliva, made me retch. I cranked the engine. It sputtered, choked on the cold, then roared to life. I didn't look back. I put it in gear and floored it, the tires screaming as I swerved around a burning luggage tug. As I sped toward the perimeter fence, I looked up at the tower, my tower. The red emergency lights were still pulsing, a heartbeat in the dark. In the window of the control room, high above the world, I saw a silhouette. It was Marcus. He was standing up, and he was looking down at me. The image of Marcus burned into my retinas, a dark, motionless shape against the rhythmic pulse of the crimson tower lights. I knew that posture. I knew the way he leaned against the console when he was waiting for a heavy to clear the runway. But this was different. There was no headset, no frantic movement of hands over a keyboard, just the stare. I pushed the accelerator until the floorboard vibrated, the engine screaming in a pitch that rivaled the wind whipping through the cracked passenger window. I hit the perimeter gate at 40 miles per hour. The plastic arm shattered like glass, a pathetic barrier against the momentum of 2 tons of steel, and a man possessed by pure, unadulterated terror. The airport was behind me now, a sprawling graveyard of multi-million-dollar machinery, and the things that used to be my coworkers, but the silence of the road ahead was somehow worse. Usually, the approach road to the terminal was a vein of constant motion, shuttles, taxis, frantic travelers chasing departures. Now, it was a gauntlet of abandoned luggage and stalled vehicles. I swerved around a TSA SUV that had been driven headlong into a concrete pillar, the driver's side door hanging open like a broken wing. Blood was smeared across the white paint, a frantic handprint that trailed off into nothing. I didn't stop. I couldn't. Every instinct groomed by years of managing high-stress air traffic told me to maintain separation, to keep the distance, to never let the targets merge. My hands were shaking so violently, I had to white-knuckle the steering wheel just to keep the car straight. I reached the interchange for the main highway and felt my heart drop into my stomach. The outbound lanes were a parking lot. Red tail lights stretched into the horizon. A stagnant river of fire that went nowhere. People had tried to flee, and they had died in their seats. I saw a woman standing on the roof of a minivan, screaming at the sky, her voice lost to the wind, while figures moved between the stalled cars below her with a predatory, jerky grace. I yanked the wheel to the right, bouncing the car over the median and onto the grassy embankment, the suspension groaning as I bypassed the gridlock. I needed to get to the outskirts, to the places where the density was lower, but even as I bounced back onto a secondary service road, I realized the scale of the collapse. The horizon toward the city was glowing, a dull, bruised orange that wasn't the sunrise. It was the city burning. I checked my fuel gauge. A quarter tank. In my rush to get to my shift 8 hours ago, I told myself I'd fill up on the way home. That decision now felt like a death sentence. Every mile I traveled, the needle crept lower. A countdown clock to my own obsolescence. I turned off the radio after 5 minutes of listening to the emergency alert system's looping tone. That digital screech was the sound of the world ending. A mechanical requiem that offered no instructions, no hope, just the cold acknowledgement that the structures of authority had folded. I was an air traffic controller. I lived for the voice on the other end of the line, the coordination, the system. Without the system, I felt like I was free-falling without a chute. I found a small gas station on the edge of a residential district, tucked away behind a screen of dying oaks. It looked quiet, which was the most dangerous thing it could be. I pulled in slowly, dousing my headlights, letting the car coast to a stop near the back of the building, rather than the pumps. I sat there for a full minute, my breath fogging the glass, the fire extinguisher still resting on the passenger seat, like a blunt, holy relic. I needed water. I needed gas. I needed to think. I cracked the door, the hinges whispering a protest. The air smelled of wood smoke and something metallic, the coppery tang of spilled blood. I stepped out, my legs feeling like lead. I moved toward the side entrance of the station, my eyes darting toward every shadow. A rustle in the trash cans made me jump, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it blurred my vision. It was just a cat, its fur matted, bolting into the darkness. I let out a jagged breath that sounded like a sob. The glass of the front door was smashed. I stepped over the shards, the crunching sound feeling as loud as a gunshot in the oppressive stillness of the night. Inside, the aisles were a wreck. Shelves were overturned, bags of chips trampled into a salty dust. I went straight for the cooler. The power was still on. The hum of the compressors, a hauntingly normal sound. I grabbed 2 gallons of water, cradling them like they were made of gold. Then I saw it, a reflection in the glass. A figure was standing by the coffee station, its back to me. It wore a high-visibility vest, a road crew worker. It was hunched over something on the floor, its shoulders moving in a rhythmic, wet motion. The sound reached me then, the sound of a zipper being torn open, followed by a soft, slurping noise. I froze. I didn't breathe. I tried to back away, one slow step at a time, but my heel caught on a discarded soda bottle. It skittered across the tile. The figure stopped. It didn't turn its head first, It turned its entire torso, its spine cracking with a sound like dry kindling. The face was gone below the nose, a raw, red cavern of shredded muscle and exposed bone. It let out a sound that wasn't a moan or a growl, but a sharp, forced hiss, like air escaping a pressurized cabin. It lunged. I didn't think. I swung the fire extinguisher. With a desperation born of pure lizard brain survival, the heavy metal cylinder caught the thing in the temple, the impact vibrating up my arms and into my teeth. It went down, its head hitting the corner of a metal shelf with a sickening thud. But it didn't stay down. It scrambled, its fingers clawing at the slick floor, trying to find purchase. I hit it again and again. I didn't stop until the extinguisher was slick with dark viscous fluid, and my lungs were burning. I stood over it, gasping, the adrenaline dumping into my system and leaving me nauseous. I realized then that the silence had returned, but it was thinner now, more fragile. I grabbed a plastic crate, filled it with as many canned goods and lighters as I could find, and retreated to the car. I didn't have a siphon, and the pumps were dead without a credit card authorization that would never come. I had to make the quarter tank last. I drove through the night, sticking to the back roads, avoiding the main arteries that were now clogged with the remains of a civilization that didn't know how to stop moving. By the time the sun began to bleed over the horizon, a pale, sickly yellow through the haze of smoke, I found myself on a ridge overlooking the valley. I pulled over, the engine ticking as it cooled. I looked down at the suburbs. From this distance, it looked almost normal, until you noticed the lack of movement. No school buses, no commuters, just thin plumes of smoke rising from dozens of different points, like signals from a lost tribe. I opened a bottle of water and drank half of it in one go, the cold liquid shocking my system. I thought of Marcus again. I wondered if he was still up there, watching the runways, watching the empty sky. We were trained to manage the flow, to ensure that everything landed where it was supposed to. But there were no more landings. There was no more flow. The world had suffered a total system failure, a mid-air collision of reality and nightmare, and we were the debris falling to earth. I reached into the glove box and pulled out my tablet. It was dead. I threw it onto the floorboard. I was a man of data, of coordinates, of radio frequencies. None of that mattered now. I needed a map, a real paper map. I needed to find somewhere with a fence that wasn't made of chain link. Somewhere with a sightline that didn't involve a radar screen. The psychological toll was starting to settle in, a heavy, cold weight in my chest. I had left them. I had left the pilots on the frequencies, the ground crews, the people in the terminals. I had followed the first rule of an emergency: put on your own oxygen mask before assisting others. But there was no one left to assist. I was the last controller of a dead sector. I started the car again, the needle now hovering dangerously close to the red line. I had maybe 20 miles of range left. I decided to head north, toward the mountains, toward the wilderness areas where the population density dropped to nearly zero. It was a gamble, a flight plan with no destination and an unknown fuel reserve. But staying still was a controlled flight into terrain. As I drove, I saw a billboard for an insurance company, a smiling family, under the words, "Protecting Your Future." I started to laugh, a jagged, hysterical sound that filled the cabin until it turned into a cough. The future was a luxury we couldn't afford anymore. We were living in the overhead, the dead time between the disaster and the end. I passed a farmhouse where a man was standing in his driveway with a shotgun, watching me go by. He didn't wave. He didn't ask for help. He just watched, his eyes hard and hollow. We were all islands now, separated by a sea of teeth and hunger. I found a small country church an hour later. It was a simple white building with a steeple that looked like a needle stitching the gray sky. I pulled the car into the graveyard behind it, hiding it behind a row of ancient cedars. This was it, the end of the road. I checked my supplies: 6 cans of soup, 4 gallons of water, a box of granola bars, and a fire extinguisher that had become a part of me. I sat in the pews for a long time, the silence of the church a different kind of quiet than the airport. It was heavy with the weight of centuries of prayer, of people looking for an answer to the same questions I was asking now. Why? How? What comes next? I didn't find any answers. I just found a temporary reprieve from the wind. I went to the small office in the back of the church and found a landline phone. I picked up the receiver, knowing it was useless, but I did it anyway. I held it to my ear, hoping for a dial tone, hoping for the crackle of a human voice, for someone to give me a heading, a clearance, anything. There was nothing, just the empty hiss of a deadline. I looked out the window at the graveyard. The headstones were gray teeth rising from the earth. I wondered how long it would be before the people under those stones started getting up too, or if the horror was limited to the fresh, the recently departed who hadn't yet found peace. I spent the next 3 days in that church, rationing my food, watching the road from the steeple. I saw things move in the distance. Small groups of figures, always walking with that same relentless stumbling gait. They didn't seem to have a destination. They were just moving, driven by a biological imperative that had replaced their souls. On the 4th day, I heard it, a sound that made my heart stop. It wasn't a moan or a scream. It was the low, distant thrum of an engine, not a car engine, a jet. I scrambled up the ladder to the steeple, my binoculars shaking in my hands. I scanned the horizon, my eyes burning. There, to the east, a silver speck was cutting through the haze. A Gulf Stream, maybe, or a small commercial regional jet. It was low, too low, and it was trailing a plume of black smoke from its left engine. It was screaming across the sky, a wounded bird looking for a place to die. I reached for a radio that wasn't there. I wanted to tell them the winds. I wanted to tell them the runway at the airport was blocked by a burning 737. I wanted to tell them there was no one left to guide them in. I watched as the plane banked hard, its wings dipping precariously. It was trying to find a flat stretch of land, a highway, a field, anything. But the world was too cluttered, too broken. I watched as the silver speck disappeared behind a ridge, followed seconds later by a dull, muffled boom that shook the glass in the steeple windows. A ball of orange fire rose above the trees, A funeral pyre for 50 people I would never know. I slumped against the wooden beams, the tears finally coming. I was an air traffic controller. My job was to bring them home. And I had watched them fall. I realized then that the world I knew wasn't just dying, it was being erased, one frequency at a time. The sky was empty now, truly empty. I looked down at my hands, the calluses from the extinguisher still raw. I wasn't a controller anymore. I was a ghost haunting ruins. They would tell stories of miracles, of divine intervention, of a sudden change in the nature of the plague. They wouldn't know about the man in the tower, the air traffic controller who refused to let the sky fall. They wouldn't know about the final sacrifice of a mind that chose to become a lighthouse for the dark instead of a predator within it. And that was fine. Control was never about credit. It was about the smooth flow of the pattern. It was about making sure everyone got to where they were going, even if where they were going was oblivion. The sun was high now, the glass of the tower cab baking in the heat. I could see my reflection in the window, a pale, sunken thing with eyes that burned with an unnatural amber light. I didn't recognize the face, but I recognized the soul behind it. It was the soul of a man who had spent his life staring into the void and telling it where to sit. I was no longer afraid of the betrayal of the dead. I had embraced it and turned it into a duty. I was the one who stayed behind to turn off the lights. I was the one who made sure the last flight was logged. My thoughts were becoming simpler now, shedding the complexities of language and identity, replaced by the pure geometry of movement and distance. Heading, altitude, speed. These were the only words that mattered. They were the bones of the universe. I felt my consciousness expanding, leaving the cramped confines of the tower and spreading out over the tarmac, over the lake, over the abandoned cities and the silent forests. I was the network. I was the grid. I was the final controller of the last great evacuation. In the distance, I saw a single, real plane, a small white dot against the blue. It shouldn't have been there. It was a ghost from another era, some desperate survivor who had found a working engine and enough fuel to try for the horizon. I felt a flicker of the old tension, the old professional reflex.